Good day! Welcome to English class. I am Teacher Arnold, always ready to learn and to give you learning. Today, we will discuss the content of an outline using notes from primary and secondary sources. When you do research, you have to gather information and evidence from a variety of sources, from primary and secondary sources. Primary sources provide raw information and first-hand evidence. Examples: interview transcripts, statistical data, and works of art. A primary source gives you direct access to the subject of your research, while in secondary sources provide second-hand information and commentary from other researchers. Examples: journal articles, reviews, and academic books. A secondary source describes, interprets, or synthesizes primary sources. Now, what is a primary source? A primary source is anything that gives you direct evidence about the people, events, or phenomena that you are researching. Primary sources will usually be the main objects of your analysis. If you are researching the past, you cannot directly access it to yourself. So you need primary sources that were produced at the time by participants or witnesses. Example: letters, photographs, and newspapers. If you are researching something current, your primary sources can either be qualitative or quantitative data that you collect yourself. Example: through interviews, surveys, experiments, or sources produced by people directly involved in the topic. Example: official documents or media texts. Now let's know more about primary source. Research field has three. Its primary sources are the following: letters and diaries, photographs and video footage, official documents and records, and physical objects. Research field art and literature. Its primary sources are the following: novels and poems, paintings and art installations, and films and performances. Research field communication and social studies. Its primary sources are the following: interview transcripts, recording of speeches, newspapers and magazines, and social media posts. Research field law and politics. Its primary source are the following: court records, legal texts, and government documents. Research field sciences. Its primary sources are empirical studies and statistical data. Now, what is a secondary source? A secondary source is anything that describes, interprets, evaluates, or analyzes information from primary sources. Common examples include books, articles, and documentaries that synthesizes information on a topic, synopses and descriptions of artistic works, encyclopedias and textbooks that summarize information and ideas, reviews and essays that evaluate or interpret something. When you cite a secondary source, it's usually not to analyze it directly. Instead, you'll probably test its arguments against new evidence or use its ideas to help formulate your own. When you do primary source, if your primary source is novel, then your secondary sources is article analyzing the novel. If your primary source is painting, then your secondary sources is exhibition catalog explaining the painting. If your primary source is letters and diaries written by historical figures, then your secondary sources is biography of the historical figure. But if your primary source is essay by a philosopher, then your secondary sources is textbook summarizing the philosopher's ideas. If your primary sources is photographs or historical events, then your secondary sources is documentary about the historical event. But if your primary source is government documents about a new policy, then your secondary source is newspaper article about the policy. If your primary source is music recordings, then your secondary sources would be academic book about the musical style. If your primary source is results of an opinion poll, then your secondary source is blog post interpreting the results of the poll. If your primary source is empirical study, then your secondary source is literature review that cites the studies. Example of sources that can be primary or secondary. A secondary source can become a primary source depending on your research question. If the person, context, or technique that produced the source is the main focus of your research, it becomes a primary source. Example, in documentaries. If you are researching the causes of World War II, a recent documentary about the war is a secondary source. But if you are researching the filmmaking techniques used in historical documentaries, then the documentary is a primary source. Next is reviews and essays. If your paper is about the novels of Toni Morrison, a magazine review of one of her novels is a secondary source. But if your paper is about the critical reception of Toni Morrison's work, the review is the primary source. Third, newspaper article. If your aim is to analyze the government's economic policy, a newspaper article about a new policy is a secondary source. But if your aim is to analyze media coverage of economic issues, the newspaper article is the primary source. Primary versus secondary sources. Question is, which is better? Most research uses both primary and secondary sources. They complement each other to help you build a convincing argument. Primary sources are more credible as evidence, but secondary sources show how your work relates to the existing research. What do you use primary sources for? Primary sources are the foundation of original research. They allow you to make new discoveries, provide credible evidence for your arguments, and lastly, give you authoritative information about your topic. If you don't use your primary sources, your research may be considered unoriginal or unreliable. What do you use secondary sources for? Secondary sources are good for gaining a full overview of your topic and understanding how other researchers have approached it. They often synthesize a large number of primary sources that would be difficult and time-consuming to gather by yourself. They allow you to gain background information on the topic, support or contrast your arguments with other researchers' ideas. And lastly, Gather information from primary sources that you can't access directly. Example, private letters or physical documents located elsewhere. When you conduct a literature review, you can consult secondary sources to gain thorough overview of your topic. If you want to mention a paper or study that you find cited in a secondary source, seek out the original source and cite it directly. Now, as you can see the difference of primary sources and secondary sources. In primary sources are original sources of information that have not yet been filtered through analysis, examination, or interpretation. Typically, primary sources are contemporary to the events and individuals being researched. Primary sources differs both in content and format from discipline to discipline. Below are examples of primary sources like historians, political scientists, sociologists, literary scholars, physicists, biologists, and psychologists. In secondary sources is not an original source. It has no direct physical connection to the person or event being studied. Examples of secondary sources might include historic books, articles in encyclopedias, prints of paintings, replicas of art objects, reviews of research, academic articles. Secondary sources are sometimes categorized as intentional documents or unpremeditated documents. It is called intentional documents. Example, biographies, memoirs, yearbooks that are composed deliberately to present a record of the past. Unpremeditated documents, example, novels, paintings, these are created for a particular immediate purpose, but there is no real intention that they are to be utilized for historical evidence at a later date. For example, Dickens' Little Dorrit is a novel, but it might also be useful for gaining insight into aspects of London in the 1850s. It is often difficult to distinguish clearly between primary and secondary sources. Some evidence can be both at the same time. The first edition of Encyclopedia Britannica was a secondary source when first published in 1768, but today it is a primary source to historians. And that ends with my topic. Thank you very much for tuning in to my channel. Once again, this is Teacher Arnel, where learnings in English is limitless. Thank you and goodbye.